Yaran everyone, and welcome to this new episode of our Pacific Talks, where I engage in active conversations with my guests to talk about the challenges our world is facing and seeing them through a Pacific lens. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the show Robert Oliver. Robert is a famous chef from New Zealand, and he spent his youth in Fiji and Samoa, probably where he got his passion for local ingredients, but he'll probably tell us more about it later. Robert hosted the TV series Real Pasifik, which played in more than 40 countries and is on its 75th rerun, which is quite a success. He's ambassador for the Cordon Bleu, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and UNDP Pacific Advocate for Food, Sustainable Development and Wellbeing, and is also the winner of several awards. And I personally have been pleased to welcome him as a speaker for TEDx Papete in 2016. And since then, Robert is also the founder of Pacific Food Revolution, a show that is filled with Pacific heritage and humor. And I'm quoting, uses the power of reality TV, radio, and social media to change people's eating behavior. So quite a big goal, ambitious but necessary. So Robert, welcome to Pacific Talks.
Hello, great to see you, Philippe.
So, Robert, a lot of people are quite familiar with you and with your face through your TV shows, your books, and all the events you've been a speaker at. But sometimes we feel that we know the public individuals more than the private one. So, as a start, can you tell us a little bit more about you and your career?
Mm. Yeah, like you said, I was brought up in the Pacific, and I was raised by a father who was committed to the idea that community always comes first. Through your thinking, the needs of the community always come before the needs of the individual. And so that collective approach is fundamentally a Pacific approach. I mean, that's the way Pacific society operates. But we were brought up in that environment of really afire with the idea of social quote unquote development being what our life's goal is, right? How you live. So after I lived in Fiji, I lived in New York for many years, and then I began to reflect that every cuisine had been represented in these great cities of the world, but there was no Pacific cuisine was nowhere, and I knew how great it was from the food I ate as a child, as a kid growing up. And then I was working in the Caribbean, actually, connecting farmers to hotels. The Caribbean imported a lot of its food for tourism.
Mhm.
And I realized that if you put local cuisine on the menu, that you needed local agriculture. And that was obviously a terrific economic opportunity for local farmers. So I really understood the value of cuisine as a change, an agent of change. And I worked on that project for some time, and we made incredible headways in getting local cuisine placed on the menus, getting local farmers involved. It required many people, not just me, but it was an exciting time. And I thought, man, the Pacific needs this. You know, we many of the Pacific hotels. I mean, not so much in Tahiti, to be fair, but many of the Pacific hotels have a high representation of Western food on the menu, and hence a lot of the food is imported. And the tourists are missing out on this fabulous opportunity and experience. Many people learn and engage with each other through food, and the story of the food is the story of the people. So that's really how I began my life back in the Pacific, was thinking, I've got to write a cookbook, because it's in a cookbook, people will see it, they'll look at the beautiful photos, it'll be packaged as a culture and celebrated. And that's how really my Pacific life back in the Pacific began. I never intended to stay,
Mhm.
but when the first book, the Meakai book, of which Tahiti has a significant part, and thanks to Manuel Tere, who was at Tahiti Tourism at the time and made everything happen for me to come to Tahiti and to include Tahiti in the project, that book won the best cookbook in the world in the Gourmand Awards, which was, of course, shocking to me because it was my first book. And it was because people had just internationally were exposed in a new and exciting way to what the cuisine offering of the Pacific is, and thus who Pacific people are through their food proposition. And I realized that there was a lot of work to do, so I stayed.
Mm. And I'm sure you're still discovering new things every day.
New beautiful things,
Mhm.
Philippe. New beautiful things. The further you dig into it, the better it gets.
Mm. If you have to describe in a few words, I know it's probably difficult, but what is so specific to Pacific cuisine compared to the rest of the world, what would you say it is?
The Pacific itself. I mean, the fact that the food is such a way of people sharing and building relationships and building community, and the medicinal, all the knowledge that sits behind the food, the medicinal knowledge, the cultural knowledge, the
Mm.
memories that food evokes. And I'm talking about local food. I'm not talking about fast food. I'm not talking about food that's everywhere now. I'm talking about the stuff that grandma makes.
Mm.
And when I was a kid growing up in Fiji, there was no processed food. So the food that we primarily ate was from the market or from the incredible basket of Fijian food culture and Indian food culture in Fiji, of course, because
Mm.
they got it all. They got it all there. So it's not that there's one ingredient. I could say coconut to answer that question for you, but actually, it's all the dimensions of otherness and uniqueness that
Mm.
sit behind that plate of food that make it so attractive and soulful to people.
Mm. So when I listen to you, it seems to me, and that's also something that I've experienced myself, that what's important in the Pacific food and Pacific cuisine is the tradition. Yet your show is called Pacific Food Revolution. So can you tell us a little bit about the concept of the show and why the
Sure.
name and what's the goal in all that?
And the interesting fact that I have Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Royal of Tonga, in a revolution with me, right?
Wow.
Not many royals get to do that. The Pacific Island Food Revolution was when I'd been on the path of when I realized if I start doing the cookbooks and the television and get and all these incredible people in the Pacific who are the leaders around food, the organic farmers and the chefs and their home cooks, all the people that that really capture the cuisine proposition.
Mhm.
Um, I also became aware of all the health numbers. The Pacific has the highest rates of NCDs, diabetes,
Mm.
heart disease, etc., in the world, not just in the Pacific, in the world. And yet, I knew that when I was younger, they didn't. No one talked about diabetes, and that's because we weren't. Our eating habits were still quite natural. So I was aware that people had changed the way they eat, and we all know that. And we live in a different environment. The environment is around fast food marketing and around, uh, you know, uh, the whole food environment has changed, and of course, people's eating habits have changed with it. But um, I was aware that we kind of have a bit of a mindset in the Pacific. I can't speak for everyone, but I always grew up with the idea that everything from overseas was better. Like
Mm.
we looked outwards and wanted to go to these places and viewed Paris and New York as the best, you know. Whereas actually, when you go there, you realize the best is in the Pacific,
Mm.
in pretty much every aspect of life. And so all these things played into the change in eating habits. People were eating a lot more sugary drinks. And I was like, wow, if we can just get people eating their own food again, that's going to go a long way towards addressing the health issues. How do we do that? Through my work, I already knew incredible people in Vanuatu, in Fiji, in Samoa, in the Kingdom of Tonga, who, if I put a group together, we could lead something profound. And I'd just been a judge on one of those big TV shows called My Kitchen Rules. And actually, when I took the role, I was like, gee, this is not the kind of TV I usually do. But when I did it, it's got everyone talking, it's got everyone cooking and thinking about food and talking about food. And I was like, that's what I want to bring to the Pacific. And
Mm.
my team, I've got a core group of people I've worked with for years. Dr. John Ehawea in Fiji, Vitasi Mackenzie in Vanuatu, Dora Rossi in Samoa, Suliana Siwatimbao in Fiji, Andy Tafinai in Samoa, the same Papilo Foliaki in Tonga, the same group of people I've always worked with. And we were all like, this is going to change the game. Because the great thing about those reality TV shows is they're full of local people. And if you put local, entertainment works by audience identification. So if you put someone in a show who looks like your sister, you're going to tap into that identity and feel connected and inspired by it. So we basically designed a reality cooking competition show just like MasterChef,
Mm.
and between Fiji, Samoa, Vanuatu, Tonga, where we get to cook solutions to the problems. If, for example, in Fiji there's a high anemia rate, and yet there's all these greens in the market, why are people not eating them? Well, because of all the reasons I mentioned before, the fast food marketing, and there's a deference to the Western way, which the fast food marketers have really understood and worked towards. So we did an episode in the show which is about new recipes with the greens. And that way we get to kind of put new energy into local crops. And it's coming from the people in the show. It's not coming from me. It's coming from people from their cultural position. So it's just taken off. And then we have episodes in each country, and then the countries, we have a winner from each country, and then the countries go head to head. And you know what a sports field is like in the
Mm-hmm.
Pacific? We're doing the same in food. And it's just been amazing, and people love it. And what I've realized is that, and this was always my dream, we've together we've made something that people want to be a part of. And that's magic. That's real magic. So, and we're getting results in from our surveys that showing people are really, it's working. People are really considering what they eat. They're getting knowledge through the show, and more importantly, inspiration through their own country people in the show. The
Mm.
show is, when I say the show, it's much bigger than a show. The TV leads a very broad social media campaign, uh, and many other communication methods sit around the basic TV show. But I chose TV because TV is one of those hero products that stands out above the rest and that
Mm.
everyone tunes into. And so it's fun, and it's fun, and it's a joyous celebration of Pacific people and food. It's not a usual NCD approach, which is saying, don't eat something, don't do that. And
Mm.
no one does what they're told to do. That's just life.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's always easier to spread the message with fun and humor than through like seriousness or like kind of like condescending approach of telling people
Yeah.
what to do and how to do it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
And it's caught on in many ways. I mean, people hadn't realized, for example, that their own food system was a solution to the NCD crisis.
mm,
And had never been put forward as a whole proposition. And that was tremendously moving for many people. We've had a lot of feedback on that, just saying, I just hadn't thought of it that way. And that's awesome.
mm, indeed. So, would you say that the revolution that is in the name of your show is a revolution that leads back to the traditions, or that a revolution that says let's use the wisdom of the past to tackle the challenge of today and tomorrow? And what approach do you think you're heading to?
I saw the movie Whale Rider, and written
Mm,
by the great New Zealand writer Witi Himera. And one line stood out to me, and that is, tradition must evolve to remain relevant. So we're working off the traditional food base and the traditional dishes. We're bringing new energy in to contemporize it, and also young people, we found in our earlier research, often shy away from the word tradition because they think it means it's dated,
mm,
belongs to the past, belongs to a generation or two above them, and they don't feel a place in it. So we were anxious to make a place for young people to appreciate tradition, and they do once they're exposed to it in a way that they get to participate in its evolution.
mm.
Yeah,
Interesting. So I wanted to go back to these issues of the NCDs. There is quite a big crisis in the Pacific. What are for you the core causes or the root of the problem? Because obviously you need to get people back to eating a food that is more adapted to the environment and their culture and traditions. But do you think there are other causes that are at the root of this NCD problem?
well, like I guess I'd go back to what I mentioned before around the environment changing.
Hmm.
And I don't mean the natural environment, I mean the narrative environment, all the marketing of fast foods. The fact that traditional food is often seen as labor intensive, takes a long time. But actually, look at all the crops, and you could do something very quick with all of them. So, just a slight, NCDs are a result of a food culture that's just a little bit off its own tracks, but it can be put back onto its tracks quite easily. And if you look at the great, what we would consider to be the great cuisines of the world, like Thai cuisine or French cuisine, or they keep changing and
Mm.
moving and being reinvented, and there's a lot of energy from the people sitting behind them. And so that's the dynamic that we wanted to. That is the revolution dynamic, and that is led by people.
Mm. And in this revolution, do you think like chef like you, even if it may not be a traditional way of approaching cuisine, which is usually more communal, more traditional, but having like this new approach of restoration of chef or like TV shows, do you think that's a way to kind of like in like connect the two different cultures with like the traditional ingredients and yet the modern way of bringing food or getting people interested in food.
Yes, I mean that's the idea behind the design that we have now, and
Mm,
and I can tell you that it's working. We're seeing it in our monitoring and evaluation results. We're funded by the New Zealand and Australian government, which I'm very grateful for. It's a real sign of their commitment to the well-being of Pacific people, their genuine commitment, um, not just diplomacy, but really doing something, And the the bit that's exciting to us is we are seeing the numbers bringing that in, and it's not about tradition being dated. It's that's just where you start. That's the whole
mm,
foundation of where you begin, and the tradition, remember, is based in the natural world.
of course.
Yeah.
Indeed. So in the way we educate people, as you said, you through your show, there's a goal to educate and using fun and TV, which is like a very popular medium. But you also see a lot of campaigns from NGOs, from health departments, trying to use maybe another type of approach to educate people and say, oh, you need to change your diet, you need to exercise more, and all those may not fit exactly the way of life of the Pacific. So to your expertise in the problem, how do you think that educating people should integrate more elements of the traditional and the more like environmentally adapted way of living of the Pacific people?
Well, I don't think a solely nutritional approach helps. That
Mm,
is giving people science, and they've got to understand that, and that's the field of nutritionists. I just think that um, or, I mean, there have been lots of campaigns by many agencies for many, many years, and based on good intention and good knowledge, but they don't seem to have grabbed. So so much development, quote unquote. I use that word because I often find it's actually the developers that need developing, not Pacific people. I mean, Pacific cuisine is developed. I'm just
mm,
all we're doing is saying, hey, look at this stuff. This is what's going to help us. I mean, that's exciting to us is that Pacific cuisine is a Pacific solution to a Pacific problem. I
mm,
don't, they don't need consultants like me to come and do that. I'm just putting the framework in. That's all to expose it. But I I also think that many development approaches um, often come in with really good ideas and looking for very good outcomes, but they don't. And this is a very sweeping generalization because many of them do this as well. They don't understand what people really want, what really turns them on, what will really grab them, what will get them excited about this prospect, whatever they're proposing. And that's why we chose entertainment and that's why we chose TV,
mm,
because TV does that. It gets
mm,
people all fired up and it gets people watching it as families. And so that's why the entertainment opportunity is, to me, a great opportunity. And all of the other campaigns, by the way, I would never speak negatively of them. I would love to work with them actually because we're all on the same path in a different way. But I can honestly say that our campaign is having an effect.
Mm. And so,
Mm.
if I could summarize the role that you're playing, is to say, to be kind of like a canary in the coal mine, saying to people, hey, by the way, how about we talk about this problem and how we can find solutions together, instead of coming and say, this is how you should do things.
Well, it'd be great if there was just one or two campaigns rather than 100.
Mm. Yeah.
Even from an economic perspective, that doesn't make
Mm.
sense. And when we have worked with the ministries in the region, it's been tremendously successful, and we want to work with everybody.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, in a recent interview with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, you said, and I quote, the inherent generosity of nature there is unmatched. Food is everywhere, natural, nutritious. Staying on the natural path and valuing what the Creator has given is key to health and well being in the Pacific. So, that summarized what we just talked about. Beyond the immediate issue of NCDs, how do you think we can encourage a locally based economy that can help local diets, local food, local ingredients to
Mm.
be more widely spread, more widely attractive to customers, and get into this, because it's here now, we have to deal with it, the economic system as it is. How can we match those
Yeah.
two?
I just want to address first of all, I don't remember that interview at all. So, but I do like
I
what
did my
I said.
research.
Okay, but I just want us to reflect for a moment, Philippe, and everyone to reflect. Everyone in the Pacific, we we live in the Garden of Eden.
Mhm.
It's not a concept for us. Where else do we have such generosity of nature, of oceans, of society, of land? Where do we have organics naturally occurring, throwing themselves at us to eat? We are truly, truly blessed. And I'm not a religious person, but my God concept sits around the generosity of the natural design, the design that has been given as a gift to Pacific people. So to me, there's a spiritual element that comes along with eating well and sitting within that natural space, as opposed to the chemical space or the process space. We've actually been given it. We don't have to work hard to
Mm.
be there. So what blessed people the Pacific people are, let alone the knowledge of how to use it, which is what the grandmothers and the food culture and the culture itself provides. So let us not forget, we start off, we may have this big problem, but we have this massive asset sitting in our day to day lives that we probably take for granted. And we may not see it in such a grand term, but I certainly do. All of
Mm.
my work and the intertwining of the notion of food and universal good and faith sit within my being through all my work, and all of my partners in the Pacific are exactly the same. We talk about this a lot.
Mm.
But I also want to reflect on what is food. What is a plate of food? It's much more than what's on the plate. It goes into all of the society positions of culture and identity and pride and memories. But on the other side of it, you could look at that same plate and look at the development agendas, climate change. There's a big relationship between climate change and food. If we choose to eat local food, we're choosing to eat food that grows locally and has a positive effect on the environment. That's a political act, and that's what everyone in the Pacific can be doing. These this is a revolutionary thinking. You see what I'm
Mm.
saying? You look at economic development. If we promote the cuisine through the tourism machine, it flows into local farmers and their supplies, into women's groups making, I'm just making this up, but into women's groups making value-added products, the chutneys and the that can go on the tourism menus and then go back home with the tourist. I can list a big list of development agendas that if you base them on the plate of local food, you bring the two together, the joy from the society and the
Mhm.
inspiration from the society with the development goal.
Mm.
So there's not one answer for that. It's just a broad view.
Yeah. So if I hear you correctly, in order for local food, for example, to get into hotels, as you mentioned earlier, that they don't do most of them for now, or if we want those local foods to get into school canteens and all those like big institution that requires a lot of products and stuff, does it require like a political will to make those products
Everything.
more attractive?
It requires everything, and it requires a long-term view. When I
Mm.
was, a lot of you go to a hotel and say, "Why don't you buy from local farmers?" Or they say, "Well, they don't have what I need, and they didn't show up," or something. Well, that needs a strategy with a 10 or 20 year view between the various ministries, policy, community organization, processes need to be developed. But it requires politicians who view beyond their own political season. And I can tell you something, Vanuatu is about to lead us all on this
Mm.
because Vanuatu has taken the COVID pause in tourism to say, is our tourism really working for us? And they are redesigning a tourism model that does put food and people and the benefits front and center of their tourism whole machine. And I know this because Vitasi Mackenzie Rowe, who is my co-host in Vanuatu on Pacific Island Food Revolution, is leading exactly
Yeah.
that.
That's a very
Yeah,
good news, and that's
yeah,
very relevant to every island here also in
very
Fiji.
relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think many islands have tried. I know Fiji's tried for years, but it does require a very strategic, long view to
Mm,
work.
indeed. All
Mm,
right. I want to take a bigger view here and go into more global issues. As you said, food and climate change are highly related to each other. We know how much the meat industry, for example, is impacting a lot greenhouse gases emissions. So recently, I don't know if you read his book, but Bill Gates wrote a book called "How to Avoid a Climate Disaster." And he suggested that to help reduce drastically greenhouse gas emissions, one solution could be to completely give up on meat production. And he also suggested that lab grown meat, or either out of plant or out of meat cells, could help on this. So I want to know what's your view on this new development around the meat industry, the future of the meat industry,
mm.
and the new alternatives that are coming. And also, did you test already this new meat?
No, I haven't actually, and I've passed in the supermarket a few times, and I've found that I've always loved meat. I've
Mm,
always loved meat. I've always been a carnivore, and I've been brought up on meat, and I've related to meat as being fundamental to the center of the plate. You know, um, but I found that I'm barely eating meat, and it's been a slow thing for me. I never eat meat at home. I will occasionally eat meat if I go out. I have been affected by the climate change data that you've mentioned. I want to make one note to that there is also there's a whole field of thought about farming correctly,
mm,
and I look at what Bill Nyman is doing in California, for example, around farming in a way that is productive for the environment. So it is possible to do that, but the economists keep saying that that's not possible, and that's only because it hasn't been scaled up. That's the only reason that hasn't been taken on as a global
mm,
model. But then you look at the mass, the what do they call it? The massive livestock
mm.
facilities in the United States, which just destroy the environment, and also we all know all the agricultural ramifications of that, and that's where the climate change bit comes in. But I found, because I've been exposed to so much climate change and meat data, I also have been exposed to realizing that it's not good to eat too much meat from a nutritional perspective. And traditionally, it's come up for me a lot through Pacific Island Food Revolution that Pacific people never did eat a lot of meat. Even though it was had high status, it was still low quantity. And the other thing was around cruelty. I don't personally want to be part of a killing
Mm.
cycle. I wouldn't kill an animal because I love animals. And so why am I eating them? And I've got to understand that consciousness when I do eat. I often ignore it, which because I love meat. But I would say to your question, I don't think that people should be told that they've got to stop eating meat. I think people should take this knowledge in, and as they will, and do what they can, and do it realistically. If it's just cutting down a bit, if it's something, but a raise in consciousness requires a response in our individual lives, and it may not be the absolute purity, but it'll still get us there.
Yeah.
And if you, it's like dieting, the dieting concept. People don't do it because it's horrible, right? and so make it attractive. And if that just means cutting down or just developing consciousness, that's enough.
So that's actually something that I did a few years ago, where I stopped and reflected on my own way of eating, and I kind of tried to, different options, different alternatives. I asked myself, should I become vegan, or should I stop completely meat, or should? And I eventually realized, like, okay, I'm gonna at least start making sure that I buy good ingredients and that I don't overeat, and that I know, like, where my products are coming from. So you think that if at least everyone was more intentional in the way they eat, at least if they have the ability to be that intentional and to access good food, because it's obviously there's an economical cost to it. Do you think that's that would help a lot in tackling climate change through the food question?
Absolutely. And it's all back to our intention to evolve as human beings, isn't it? I mean, if we take in things that we know to be true and don't respond to them in our lives, we are the ones who suffer.
Mm.
Mm.
And do you think another option also, in order to envision this problem that is affecting everyone globally, would be to say maybe the uniformization that we all experience since the couple of last decades, where everyone wants to eat meat, everyone wants to have fast food, everyone wants to very much have the same food everywhere. Maybe also the cause of this heavily industrialized food industry, and maybe going back to localized food habits or food traditions could also help to tackle this issue.
Absolutely. And also try to understand the difference between truth and marketing, because marketing will always tell you it's truth, but really most of us know better. And I just want to say that the COVID experience has had a silver lining in the Pacific for sure. I look at Fiji and people are back in the backyard. There's many crops you don't need to be a farmer or a gardener to grow. It's just that little layer of consciousness has kicked in, and they're like, actually, we can do this. We can look after ourselves a little better, and it's not hard. And there's many wins around the process, around less food imports, better nutrition, less reliance on some international actor in terms of supply. So yeah, I think increments is good. Yeah.
So it's all about being maybe more flexible than trying to have everything at the same level for everyone, but which
Yeah.
could also
It's
require
not.
for people to accept that they may not be able to eat the same food as in New York, for example, but it's not bad per se.
Well, I mean, this goes back to a thing around the role of chefs. I mean, one with Pacific Island Food Revolution, we're happy to have a couple of chefs in the show, but it's not a chef show. This is a food culture show, and it's driven. We've got many of our contestants who are in the show from the different countries. We make sure there are not too many chefs. It's good to have some because they drive the passion and the creativity, and they want to win and all that kind of stuff. But culture begins at home. It begins in the history, and usually in what grandma made.
Mm. So we should
Yeah.
make more TV shows about grandma's recipes then.
There was one challenge that I gave the contestants, and I don't remember what it was, but I was explaining what they were going to cook, and they a couple of them went for their phones to like Google it, and I said, don't ask Google, ask grandma.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right. So one tradition of the Pacific Talks is around the end of the interview to come up with a quote from another person, another thinker, and to expose it to my guests, and to kind of like have ideas collide together and see what comes out. So for you, I chose today a quote from the Optimist Telescope, which is a book written by an academic called Bina Venkataraman, who writes this. While it took 10,000 years from the dawn of civilization to the invention of the airplane, it took less than 7 decades from the first airplane flights in Earth's atmosphere to the moon landing. In a matter of decades, the world as people know it today will seem distant to us. So, knowing how humanity has indeed changed exponentially along the generations, what do you think will be the future of our food in 20 and 30 years from now?
The first thought I have when I hear that is how fragile traditional knowledge actually is. It can be lost in one or two generations, and
Mm,
it's a treasure that we mustn't lose. We mustn't lose in the rush to be something else. And that's probably my main thought from that. I just would very much not like to see a future food that is disconnected from the cultural base and the natural base that that, as I said, I believe was given to us by God.
mm.
Mm,
Interesting. I had the opportunity sometimes to do workshops on future, and I usually take food because it's something that people can easily imagine. And I ask people, what do you think we will have for dinner in 20 years? And every now and then people come saying like, oh, we'll eat through pills or IVs or all those things that I think reveal some kind of fear of what's going to happen in the future. So as you are a chef, you know food and you know even more than a lot of people, local ingredients and traditional cuisine. How, what could be your recommendation for all of us to make sure that we preserve our health and our well-being in the future, knowing how the world is going with climate change, with all those issues that we're facing right now?
mm. This is the goal of Pacific Island Food Revolution: is to re-energize our memories, remember how profound these cultures are. And yes, we will evolve them and catalyze them, but we'll always use them as inspiration moving forward. And you can't get more advanced than knowing who you are. That's where that's. And I'm speaking on a societal level as well.
Mm,
We don't need to be all Western. That we are Western. Of course, we've taken in the Western attributes that are suitable to us, but we don't have to. We don't have to forget anyone in any culture. Forget who they are in the process.
mm. And maybe try to take the best of both worlds as much as
That
possible.
I think the Pacific does a pretty good job of that a lot of the time. By the way,
Yeah,
I think
I
it
do.
does a really good. I mean, I see the leadership in the Pacific as being profound.
Mm,
Profound. It's not often in the packages that people are used to perceiving as leadership. They're used to leadership being associated to power
mm,
and often to one person. And I certainly don't see leadership that way. And I witness leadership being a community that's often articulated or activated by one person, but the consensus is what excites me. And even with Pacific Island Food Revolution, sure, it may have been my innovation that I bought, but I wouldn't have bought it if my group didn't think it was the right one, and if it wasn't right for their countries and for their knowledge. So yeah, I mean, I'm always concerned about getting confused with some of the endless development consultants we see traipsing through the Pacific, who often mean really well, but don't have that deep understanding of people to
mm.
add to the mix. Yeah.
Indeed. So
Mm.
my last question for you, Robert, will be about that and the future that we're all facing with all those issues. If anyone listening to this podcast is actually thinking of getting engaged, starting something, whether a business, an NGO, or whatever community project, who's trying to get into the shoes of a leader and say, I want to change something in the world, but that can feel helpless looking at all the problems that we're facing. What would be your recommendation or your advice for this person and to help her or him really like step up and get into action?
I mean, the ease with which you can create and communicate a message through social media is unbelievable. That's really only in the last 15 years we've had that opportunity. And so that's where to begin, is the dialogue, the narrative. And really, I think it's really important to investigate within yourself, what is my motivation for doing this? Who is it going to affect, and how deeply have I consulted with them? And how deeply are they actually driving the process? But also, people often, people see me, they see me as a person on TV, but that's just the shiny bit that hangs at the end of years of work and fundraising and development and developing relationships and deeply understanding what's going to work. So don't expect instant results, but because they don't tend to hold. They don't they're not supported by the deep connectivity that doing the work really creates. And then the other one very obvious thing I would say is that make sure it's something that you really love,
Mm.
because if you really love it, you'll do it really well and you'll stay with it.
That is true. And probably make sure that you bring food on the table, because that's the best way to get people together.
Always. It's always worked for me, Philippe.
I'm sure, and I'm sure your table is always one of the best to go to. So,
Thank you. Well,
all right.
I must come back to Tahiti at some point, because the food that I had there was just unbelievable. I often salivate thinking about it.
We do have a
Yeah,
good gastronomy that takes the best of different cultures, and that's always a
absolutely.
good experience. All
Absolutely.
right. Well, Robert, thank you very much for giving us
Thank
some
you.
time for this conversation and sharing your knowledge and your motivation to lead the food revolution in the Pacific. That is much needed, and I'm sure will influence the rest of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Philippe. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. Have a good day.
Okay, you too. Bye bye.
Bye.